Have you ever looked back at a moment that nearly broke you and realized it shaped you in ways nothing else could? Have you ever asked, why did I go through that? Why me? Why then? And received only silence? There are wounds you stopped talking about, not because they stopped hurting, but because no one understood them when you tried. There were nights that didn't just leave scars, they rewired you. They altered the way you trust, the way you move, the way you breathe when no one's watching. And for the longest time, you thought it was just random, just bad luck, just cruelty without meaning. But what if it wasn't? What if that pain, the one you'd do anything to erase, wasn't chaos? What if it was training, not to harden you, but to refine you, not to break you, but to prepare you for a version of yourself you couldn't become any other way? In this video, we won't romanticize suffering, but we will decode it, so you can stop surviving your past and start owning the strength it gave you. Some pain doesn't come with answers. It arrives uninvited, without warning. And when it does, it doesn't just hurt, it confuses. There are moments you lived through that didn't feel like lessons. They felt like punishment, a betrayal of whatever trust you had left in the world. Something happened, maybe years ago, maybe last night, and no matter how many times you replayed it, you couldn't find the lesson. All you found was silence, emptiness. Maybe you were a child who learned too early that comfort could vanish in a single scream. Maybe you were an adult, holding your life together with shaking hands, and still the world asked more of you, and no one told you why, no one told you how. You just kept going, you adapted. But inside, a question grew like a stone. Why did that happen? You didn't want a happy ending. You just wanted meaning. You wanted it to make sense. But it didn't. It haunted you, followed you into relationships, leaked into your decisions, shaped your beliefs, and because it didn't make sense, you blamed yourself. That's what trauma does. It confuses chaos with character, and it makes you think your pain was proof you deserved it. But what if it wasn't? What if the pain that never made sense wasn't supposed to? Not at the time, not yet, because sense-making doesn't happen in the middle of the fire. It happens long after, when the ash cools and you look around and see who you've become. There are wounds you carry that were never about karma, never about fairness. They were part of something larger than explanation. They broke you open. They revealed you to yourself. And if it feels like that's too poetic to be real, it's because you're still holding the wound, not the wisdom. You're still in the space between impact and insight, and that's okay. Viktor Frankl, a man who survived the unspeakable, once said, "In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. That doesn't mean your pain was justified. It means it can still be transformed. And the moment you begin to ask not, why did this happen to me? But who have I become because of it? You shift, you reclaim, you stop running from the pain and start using it like a map. Because not all pain comes to break you. Some of it comes to build what nothing else could. And yes, that sounds cruel at first. The idea that suffering could be training, that your worst nights could be the soil for your highest self. But think about it. Your strength didn't grow when things were easy. Your wisdom didn't come from comfort. Your compassion wasn't born from safety. It came from walking through the fire and learning to carry light anyway. And no, that doesn't mean you had to suffer. It means, now that you did, it no longer has to be meaningless. You get to choose what it becomes, not in a motivational sense, in a biological one. Your brain, your body, your being has already adapted. You've already survived. Now it's time to decide who you are because of that survival. Because even if it didn't make sense then, it can now. And in the next section, we'll explore why that pain felt like punishment, and how the most senseless suffering is often where your real training began. There are stretches of life that don't just hurt, they humiliate. Moments where you look up and ask, without even speaking, what did I do wrong to deserve this? And the worst part isn't the pain, it's how long it stays. It lingers long after the event. It settles into your nervous system, into your posture, into the way you clench your jaw before you speak. Slowly, you stop seeing life as neutral. You start seeing it as something against you. Every setback feels like an attack. Every unanswered prayer feels like proof that you were forgotten. You keep going, but the going feels like punishment, like each day is a new sentence to serve. The clock keeps moving, and so do you, but you're not living. You're serving time, existing in a world that applauds your survival, but never asks what it cost. And you begin to believe that maybe this is just how life works, that joy is for others, that rest is a luxury, that love is a reward you never earned. You confuse exhaustion with discipline. You call trauma growth. You wear your burnout like a badge, not because it feels good, but because it's all you know. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It was taught, reinforced, conditioned into you by people who were wounded themselves. Maybe you were praised for being strong when you really just had no choice. Maybe your needs were ignored until you learned to stop voicing them. Maybe you grew up in an environment where emotional neglect wore the mask of normalcy, where silence was interpreted as peace and absence was mistaken for independence. Slowly, you began to associate pain with structure, discipline with love, emotional starvation with maturity. You stopped asking for softness. You stopped trusting ease. Because somewhere along the way, you were trained to expect that anything good would be followed by a punishment. That love always came with a cost. That comfort was a trap. And so you adapted, you hardened. You told yourself, I'm fine. Not because you were, but because being fine kept you from falling apart in public. Bell Hooks once wrote, "To be loving is to be open to grief, to be touched by sorrow, even sorrow that is unending." But when no one taught you what love actually looked like, you mistook control for safety. Pain became your compass, and you followed it blindly, thinking endurance was identity. But now something in you is shifting. You're starting to question why you've accepted a life of bracing. You're noticing how you flinch at good things, waiting for the crash. You're seeing how much of your so-called personality was actually a defense, a reflex, a mask that became a mirror. And while it's terrifying to admit, it's also liberating. Because if your life was shaped by conditioning, then it can be reshaped by consciousness. You are not the product of punishment. You are the survivor of it. You are not broken. You are responding to a world that made you believe pain was the price of existing. And now you know better. You are no longer begging life to be fair. You are choosing to make it yours. And that means going back to the most painful parts. Not to relive them, but to reclaim the power they tried to take from you. In the next section, we'll explore why it wasn't the event itself that broke you, but the silence that followed, and how isolation can become the sharpest edge of all. The moment itself was brutal, yes, but what came after? That's what really broke you. The quiet, the pretending, the isolation. You lived through something that shattered your inner rhythm, and then life just went on. Everyone else kept moving. You had to keep showing up, to school, to work, to conversations that felt paper thin. No one asked, no one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't look long enough to see. And so the pain didn't leave. It just went underground. It sank into your bones, your skin, your voice. You smiled when you were supposed to. You performed normal like your life depended on it. Because in some ways, it did. Deep down, you knew that breaking down would only isolate you more. So you adapted. Quietly. Invisibly. And that's where the fracture deepened. It wasn't the trauma itself that stayed. It was the silence around it. That aching, ghost-like feeling that what happened to you didn't matter enough to stop the world. And so you kept walking through the ashes, pretending you weren't burning. Bessel van der Kolk said it clearly. Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. But no one made you feel safe, so your healing never began. Instead, your body held on. It remembered. Even when your mind tried to forget, your breath would hitch, your jaw would clench, your sleep would crack open at 3 a.m. for no reason. Your stomach would tense in situations that felt normal to others. But your nervous system knew. It remembered the silence, the absence, the moment you realized no one was coming to save you. And that's the real wound. Not what happened, but that you were left to carry it alone. You started shrinking your story, your voice, your feelings, just to be more digestible. You said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. You said, "It doesn't bother me," when it wrecked you. You laughed at jokes that belittled your boundaries, because being invisible felt safer than being dismissed. And when you finally tried to speak up, they didn't hear you, or they changed the subject, or they told you it wasn't that bad. And in that moment, you learned, silence protects others, not you. So you buried it, all of it, until you didn't recognize where the pain ended and you began. But here's the truth you never got to say. What happened to you did matter. And the silence that followed was never your fault. You were never meant to process pain in isolation. You were never meant to carry it in secret. You deserved to be witnessed. You deserved someone to say, "That wasn't okay." You deserved to fall apart and still be loved. And even if no one offered that to you back then, you can offer it to yourself now. You can stop minimizing. You can stop editing your own history to make others comfortable. You can start telling the truth, even if it's just in a whisper. That is where healing begins, not in forgetting, but in acknowledging that you were abandoned inside your pain, and that abandonment is what hurt the most. You were always strong enough to survive the event. What you weren't prepared for was the aftermath. But now you are. Now you're remembering what your body never forgot, and you're slowly breaking the silence, not with rage, but with clarity. In the next section, we'll explore how that pain wasn't senseless after all, and how suffering often hides lessons no one ever taught us out loud. No one teaches you how to suffer, not in school, not in your family, not in the glossy motivational quotes on social media. But suffering, whether we ask for it or not, becomes the most immersive classroom we'll ever enter. And unlike traditional lessons, pain doesn't arrive with a syllabus. It comes wrapped in confusion, in loss, in endings that don't feel complete. And yet, if you listen closely, pain teaches things peace never will. It teaches you what matters when everything else is stripped away. It reveals the people who stand with you, and those who vanish when your light dims. It teaches you to sit with discomfort, not fix it. To breathe through moments that don't make sense. To hold yourself when no one else shows up. That's not a skill you learn in theory. It's a wisdom you bleed your way into. And while no one would wish it on themselves, those who've walked through real pain often emerge with something unshakable. Depth, presence, a stillness that can't be imitated. Tara Brach writes, "Radical acceptance is the willingness to experience ourselves and our lives as it is." That's what suffering ultimately demands of us. Not endurance, but presence. And from that presence, clarity is born. You start to see that your pain was not random, it was instructive. Not because the suffering was justified, but because it had a message no one else could translate but you. You learned the patterns of people who smile with knives behind their backs. You learned to detect dishonesty, not by words, but by tone, by breath, by silence. You learned that some people offer kindness with strings, and others offer nothing at all. And through it all, you began to refine your instincts. You learned to say less and observe more. To stop explaining your boundaries and start enforcing them. You recognized the cost of giving yourself away too cheaply. You began to measure your worth by your own internal compass, not the reaction of others. That's the curriculum no one talks about. The one taught in the back rooms of heartbreak, in the long hours of loneliness, in the tremble before you say no for the first time. This curriculum doesn't give you degrees, it gives you discernment. It doesn't reward you with applause, it sharpens you in silence. It strips away the parts of you that were never really yours, and leaves behind the truth. You were always more powerful than they told you. And now, you're using it. Not loudly, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Your silence has meaning now. Your pauses have power. You don't flinch at discomfort like before. You study it. You let it pass through you without letting it define you. That's the sign your training is working, when you no longer need the world to make sense in order to move through it with strength. You've developed an inner compass no one can take. And that didn't come from comfort. It came from fire. You didn't earn it by reading, you earned it by enduring, and now your entire body carries the memory of what you survived, not as a burden, but as armor. Not the kind that hardens you, but the kind that holds you. In the next section, we'll explore the moment your inner voice changed, the day you stopped asking, "Why me?" and how shifting that one question became the doorway to your personal power. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from asking the same question for too long and getting nothing in return. Why me? You whispered it into your pillow. You screamed it in your head while smiling in public. You wrote it down 100 times, hoping maybe the page would answer what people couldn't. And for a while, that question kept you alive. It gave structure to the chaos. It gave shape to the ache. But over time, it became something else, a chain. Every time you asked, "Why me?" you weren't just seeking meaning. You were reliving the collapse, reopening the wound, telling your body again and again that you were still lost, still unsafe, still waiting for something, anything, to make sense of it all. And when no answer came, you didn't just feel pain, you felt shame. You started to believe that maybe the silence was the answer. That maybe you were the problem, but you weren't. You were simply asking a sacred question to a world that doesn't always reply. And that realization, quiet, devastating, liberating, is what shifted everything. There comes a point where the soul simply can't carry that question anymore. Not because it's wrong, but because it's done its job. It brought you here, it cracked you open, but it can't take you any further. And in that quiet space beyond the asking, something unexpected begins to grow. Not clarity, not answers, but responsibility, ownership, a new kind of power. You start to wonder, if this pain won't explain itself, then what can I do with it? That's where your story starts again. The moment you stop needing the universe to justify what happened, and instead choose to shape what happens next. Khalil Gibran once wrote, "Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding." And suddenly you understand. Not everything is meant to be understood logically. Some things must be felt all the way through. Some truths don't arrive until you've sat in silence long enough to hear the voice beneath the screaming. The voice that says, "This happened. It wasn't fair. And now I get to decide who I become because of it." That moment, when you stop asking why and start asking how, is the moment pain loses its grip on your identity. You begin to see your story differently. You're no longer the victim of the experience. You're the sculptor of its aftermath. You take the raw, unfiltered ache and shape it into something that holds meaning, even if no one else sees it. Even if the people who hurt you never apologize. Even if the justice you hoped for never comes. You stop needing closure to heal. You start choosing healing for yourself. And that's when your entire presence changes. You stop explaining. You stop proving. You stop needing others to understand why you are the way you are. Because you understand. That's enough. You become quieter. Not because you've given up, but because you've tuned in. You've dropped the rope in a tug of war with life and picked up a pen instead. You're writing your next chapter not as a reaction, but as an act of creation. You're no longer waiting to be rescued from your past. You're building a bridge with your own hands. And in the next section, we'll explore what it means to finally meet the version of yourself that the pain was secretly shaping all along. And how becoming that person changes everything. especially who you allow near your peace. There's a moment, not dramatic, not loud, when you realize you've crossed a line inside yourself. The person you were no longer fits. It's not because you suddenly feel healed. It's not because the pain is gone. It's because the pain no longer owns you. The storm you thought would drown you became the sea you learned to swim in. You look at your own reflection and don't see the same scared eyes. There's steadiness now. Not a forced strength, but a grounded knowing. You're no longer triggered by the same chaos. You're no longer swayed by flattery or guilt or fear of abandonment. The pain you carried for years, maybe decades, no longer hijacks your nervous system every time you speak your truth. David White wrote, "The truth is that many people come to the door of the person they are meant to be, and they turn away, unwilling to give up the identity they've worn for survival. But you didn't turn away. You stood there trembling and said, 'I'm ready.' You became the person pain was trying to reveal to you, not by force, but by refusal. Refusal to betray yourself one more time. Refusal to play small. Refusal to abandon your intuition just to be accepted. It didn't happen overnight. This becoming took years. Years of overgiving and then wondering why you felt so empty. Years of attracting people who mirrored your unresolved patterns. Years of mistaking comfort for safety and guilt for love. You learned in the hardest way possible that trauma isn't just what happened. It's what you had to believe about yourself to survive what happened. And piece by piece, belief by belief, you dismantled it. You stopped calling self-sacrifice love. You stopped calling people who drained you your people. You stopped shrinking your joy to keep others comfortable. You began to speak up, not loudly, but clearly. And when your voice shook, you didn't shame yourself. You celebrated, because your truth deserved space, even if it wasn't perfect, even if no one clapped, even if you stood alone. That's when you realized peace isn't found in being understood. It's found in understanding yourself so deeply that misunderstanding no longer feels like a threat. And that kind of peace changes everything. Your energy shifts. You stop hustling to prove. You start living to align. You don't chase. You choose. You don't react. You respond. You don't beg. You bless and release. And now, when you enter a room, people feel it. They can't name it, but they sense it. The silence in you, the depth, the gravity. You don't need attention. You command respect, not through force, but through presence. Because presence isn't something you perform. It's something you earn. Earned by facing your shadow. Earned by sitting with pain when it offered no reward. Earned by walking away when your old self would have stayed. That's what this whole journey was about. Not to destroy you, but to strip you down to your truth. You are no longer who the world shaped. You are who your soul insisted you become. And you got here not because someone saved you, but because you saved yourself again and again, in quiet, lonely moments when no one clapped and no one saw. And now you walk differently, not faster, not louder, just with more meaning. In the next section, we'll explore what happens when your training is complete, and how rising with nothing left to prove gives you a power that cannot be taken away. You didn't know it at the time, but everything you endured was shaping your weapon. The betrayals, the breakdowns, the nights you collapsed on the floor with no one to call, they weren't random. They were chiseling your instincts, sharpening your silence, teaching you how to see people for who they are, not who they pretend to be. And at first, that kind of sight feels like a curse. You notice the manipulation sooner. You feel the fakeness in someone's laugh. You read the coldness in people's compliments. And it hurts, because the old version of you would have still tried, still explained, still believed they could change, but not anymore. Now, you let people reveal themselves, and once they do, you believe them. That's what your training gave you. Not a harder heart, but a clearer vision, a stronger back, a calmer pulse. You don't tremble when you're misunderstood. You don't shrink when you're judged. You don't apologize for walking away from chaos. You've learned that some doors must close for your soul to breathe. And the people you once feared losing, you now see them as distractions from the life that was calling you. They weren't the test, your response to them was. And now you walk differently. You enter rooms without needing to be seen. You speak without needing to be liked. You say no without guilt. You protect your energy like sacred ground. Your peace is no longer negotiable, because you finally understand what it took to earn it. You remember the years you abandoned yourself just to avoid disappointing others. You remember the relationships where love was used like a leash. You remember how often you bit your tongue until your throat ached just to keep the peace. That's why you move the way you do now, not with arrogance, but with sacred restraint, not with revenge, but with awareness. You don't swing the sword recklessly, you don't use your voice to wound, but you hold your truth in both hands now, steady, unflinching, ready. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "The purpose of life is to be defeated by greater and greater things." And that's exactly what happened. You were cracked open by pain, yes, but you kept standing. And in each defeat, you rose with fewer illusions, fewer excuses, fewer masks, until one day there was nothing left to protect, and everything left to become. This is who you are now, someone who knows their limits, their worth, their sacred ground, someone who has lived the breaking and chose not to break others in return. Someone who holds the sword, not for show, but for sovereignty. You don't walk around swinging it. You don't threaten people with your strength. You just carry it, quietly. And those who feel it, respect it. Not out of fear, but recognition. Because those who've walked through fire can always see another flame. You are no longer trying to become powerful. You already are. But it's a different kind of power now. One that isn't loud. One that doesn't perform, one that doesn't need permission. Your mere presence speaks, and not everyone deserves to stand in it. That's not cruelty, that's discernment. That's what the training was for. To stop giving your light to those who only came to dim it. To stop over-explaining your boundaries to people who benefited from you having none. You don't need their applause. You've become your own validation. And now that you hold the sword, not as a weapon, but as a compass, the only thing left is to walk the path it cut open for you. If this message found you in a moment of silence, if it put words to a truth you've been carrying alone, then don't keep it to yourself. Someone else out there is still in the fire, still asking why, still bleeding in silence. Share this with them. Let them feel seen. And if you want more like this, subscribe. Not out of habit, but because you know the journey isn't over. And the next message might be the one that hands you the sword.